All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my talk today on populism in the US presidential elections. I think the past week or so was very intense and polarized, in the country. I myself stayed up late multiple nights just to follow, Nevada, Georgia, in multiple swing states that, could either help President Trump reelected or Joe Biden, defeating Trump. Today's talk is not necessarily going to be just on American politics and its internal dynamics, but more about how the United States is connected with the rest of the world and how some of the things we're seeing in the US context are actually happening elsewhere as well. So the argument in that sense of my talk is going to be the rise of Trump and Sanders is not a coincidence, right? In the US context, this is actually pretty expected given the root causes of populism. And we shouldn't be very optimistic and hopeful that populism will just going to disappear once you defeat a populist incumbent. So I would say that's going to be the main thesis or the main tension that I'm trying to address here. I definitely have my own personal, views about the election, the current president, the incoming president-elect, but I'll try to make it as academic as possible. Thanks, Salome. Thanks, by the way, for inviting me, the CEP, to holding this event. Wanted to give some of an academic perspective. Salome and others are currently taking my global populism class, in which we talk about the United States as one of the cases of populism in the world, right? So in the case of Trump, for example, we make a lot of comparisons with far-right populist movements, parties in the Western European context, Sanders and others. We try to draw comparative parallels. So in my talk today, I will first talk about the root causes of populism, right? Basically, the structural reasons why populism emerges. In the populism literature, this is called as the demand side of populism, right? Populism doesn't only emerge because you have a leader like Trump or you have a leader like Sanders who creates these voters, but from the other perspective, we can actually argue that these leaders are successful because there's a demand, for such type of politics in the U.S. context and elsewhere. And then following this somewhat theoretical discussion, I want to focus on the Trump's populism in a comparative perspective. Okay, so how can we situate the rise of Donald Trump, his government, and his potential fall or potential reemergence, in the upcoming months, upcoming years? And then I will talk about Bernie Sanders' populism from a comparative perspective. So in that sense, when I say populism, I'm not only referring to right-wing populism, but I'm also referring to left-wing populism. There's a debate in the literature, whereas like left-wing populism is better than right-wing populism because it addresses some of the structural issues. I would say that's the dominant theme in the field. But in this talk, not a class, I want to take more of a centrist approach to evaluate, both the left-wing and the right-wing challenge to American politics by populist actors. And then I want to briefly talk about the crisis of American democracy, which is, I think, in line with the crisis of liberal democracy around the world, right? So the broad argument there is right now around the world, we're going through this third reverse wave of autocratization, okay? Meaning more countries today are becoming authoritarian than more democracies. So I will situate the United States in that context. And then I want to speculate a little bit based on what we saw in the campaign, So I'm going to ask this rhetorical question: can Biden restore the soul of America? Right? Oftentimes, I would say the Biden campaign built the entire message on things like decency, normalcy, characters on the ballot. We're going to restore the soul of America. So I'm going to answer this question in the negative way, but building on the literature on populism, polarization, and other things that I think would make it very hard for Biden to restore the so-called soul of the United States. And then I want to briefly reflect on the future of populism in the United States and the world. So, in terms of the root causes of populism, one of the main issues why right-wing and left-wing populism arises is the structural inequalities. And when I say structural inequalities, it's structural inequalities around ethnicity, gender, race, social class, that are becoming more and more salient in our societies. And then in response to this, we also see the rise of identity politics, especially from the left, basically trying to undermine and value marginalized identities and trying to make them more mainstream, acceptable, included, and valuing diversity, equity, all these topics that are currently, I would say, valued by the left. But I would also argue that the push towards identity politics also creates a counter identity politics, right? So while one group of people on the left are, pushing for more inclusion and they want to challenge the structural inequality, structural racism, sexism, I would argue that also leads to a counter argument, a counter movement from the right, people who feel threatened that their, existing privileges or their existing position in the society is going to be challenged. The other root cause of populism, again, around the world, and this is not just about the United States, the rise of cultural and economic nativism. Culturally, in Europe, in the US, elsewhere, you'll often hear countries and leaders talking about how the country doesn't look like how it used to look like anymore, right? So it looks like a completely different country. So you will hear this in Trump saying, America used to be much better, that's why I'm gonna make it great again. You'll see it from Marine Le Pen in France, you'll hear it from Wilders in the Netherlands. Basically this nostalgia that in the past our country was more homogenous. We didn't have people who didn't speak French. We didn't have darker skin immigrants, which I think is one of the root causes of populism, is this cultural element. There is also, I would say, after the 2008-2009 economic crisis, there is also the economic aspect of it, right? Rather than just making a culture-based argument against immigration, against multiculturalism, what we often hear is basically these immigrants and these others are taking our jobs, or our jobs are going to China, our jobs are going to Mexico, which is, I think, another root cause of nativism. And nativism, in my view, is one of the root causes of populism. Okay. The other thing I briefly mentioned in the introduction is the global decline of liberal democracy. So in the last few years, you might have heard that the US is becoming more authoritarian. We're moving away from the democratic ideal. I would tell you that that trend is actually not unique to the United States. As I said in the beginning, there are more countries today in 2020, 2019, moving towards the autocratic direction than the democratic direction. Many scholars call it the third reverse wave, right? That's similar to 1960s and 70s, where many countries moved towards an authoritarian direction. Today, we see that again. So we're basically seeing a backlash from the third wave, basically post-communist countries, moving away from the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Latin American countries, becoming more democratic. Now we're experiencing a reverse wave. The other thing, which is, I think, essentially linked to the United States presidential elections, is the growing rural and urban divide around the world. So people living in urban areas, they are more integrated into globalization. They are more tolerant, of different cultures, and they value, diversity. They value inclusion, and that's basically, the cultural element, right? Economically, the people living in urban areas have been the main beneficiaries of globalization and economic growth, while people living in rural areas have been left behind, and they basically feel that their voices are unheard. Uh, Given this rural and urban divide, and if you look at the U.S. presidential election in the county level, even in the most red state, the most urban areas are voting against Trump, and even in the most blue state, the most rural counties are voting for Trump. So I think the Electoral College itself makes us divide the states into blue states versus red states. But I would argue that the main division in the United States is not between blue states and red states, but it's between urban versus rural countries. This is interesting for us because we live in a rural county, Vinicius County, that voted for Trump twice. So I think given our location, we could actually understand some of these grievances better compared to someone who never leave the Manhattan bubble, right? So in that sense, I think we're located in a unique situation that will allow us to observe this urban-rural divide, but also within the urban, within again the blue states or the so-called progressive states, I would argue that there is still a division, between East California versus West California, upstate New York versus Manhattan, New York City. Okay, so to talk about Trump's populism, so how does Trump, fit in all these debates? Uh, I would argue that Trump has ideological similarity with the populist far right parties in Europe. Examples of that include the National Rally in France, Geert Wilders in Netherlands, Sweden Democrats, Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, Law and Justice Party in Poland. Outside of Europe, other examples include Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, Modi in India, and obviously the country that I'm from, Turkey, and Erdogan. So Trump, in that sense, belongs to this group of leaders that are not only center-right politicians, but they also have extreme far-right ideas that made it to the mainstream, okay? So Trump, I argue that he did capitalize on already existing nativist attitudes. So Trump did not create anti-immigration attitudes in the US. Trump did not create anti-Mexico, anti-China sentiments. What he did was he successfully capitalized on that, especially in rural, forgotten, parts of the country. So he not only used cultural but also economic argument. His famous escalator, going down the escalator, attacking Mexicans, calling them, rapists, drug dealers, that will be more of a cultural. Also building a wall will be cultural, but his opposition to NAFTA, his opposition to trade deals will be more like an economic nativism, right? And in the Trump's case, this is basically summarized as America first, right? America first, not only economically, but also culturally. So immigrants, especially immigrants of color, don't belong here, right? They shouldn't. They speak a different language. They're Muslims. They have different, belief systems, and they take the jobs from the Native Americans. And when we say Native here, it's not the Native American in the Native American sense. It's more like basically white Christian Americans who are thought as the real owners, of this country. How did Trump did this, right? Because what happens in European cases, most of these far-right parties, they get 15%, they get 20%. In the case of Le Pen, she got 35% against Macron, but she never got 50% and became, the president of France. I would argue that Trump did this through strategically and successfully capturing the Republican Party, right? In the 2016 primaries, Trump was an outsider, right, to the Republican Party, and he was not seen the main candidate who was entitled to get this nomination, right? There were other establishment candidates like Jeb Bush, who comes from a political family and who was one of the clear favorites in the very beginning. So the advantage of the Republican Party, because of hyperpartisanship in the United States, once you capture the Republican Party, you already start from 40%, right, with your support. Because if I am the candidate of the Republican Party, or if Salome is the candidate of the Republican Party, Republicans are going to vote for that candidate because that's the Republican candidate. And that's the same for the Democrats, right? So in that sense, because of partisanship, even though Trump's base is a minority within the Republican Party, Trump managed to not only win the nomination, but also in the 2018 midterms, he also, forced some of the establishment Republicans retire, and then he gradually, overtook the political party. Under Trump's presidency, I also argue that the liberal democratic values in the United States slowly and gradually eroded. Okay, I don't want to blame just Trump for the erosion of liberal democratic values, but only just his refusal to accept the results of the election is, I think, a good example of how he diverges from his predecessors, like George W. Bush, George the Father Bush, right, or Carter. Basically, Carter and George Bush are the ones that were one-term presidents, and then they lost, but they immediately recognized the results. The last time I checked, Trump was just tweeting about Georgia. Trump was tweeting about Wisconsin, which is, I think, an erosion of not only values, but also norms in the US. What he does is completely legal, right? So he's not violating the law. But what he's doing is eroding the trust in institutions, trust in media, and trust in the overall liberal democratic system. So to talk about Sanders, so my argument is Trump basically successfully managed to capture the Republican Party as a far-right candidate. Sanders attempted to capture the Democratic Party from the left. Okay, he defines himself as a democratic socialist. Although I would want to raise some caution here, Sanders' version of democratic socialism corresponds to social democratic values in the European context, right? So advocating for free healthcare, free education, these are ideas in Europe that are even accepted by some center-right political parties. But in the US context, I argue that Sanders did challenge the Democratic establishment. Initially, Hillary Clinton, I think, initially thought she was going to get the nomination very easily, right, in 2016, but that did not happen. And then in the latest 2020, Sanders again reemerged, and he challenged this time Biden and other establishment Democrats. Ideologically, Sanders' closest, I would say, ideological cousins in Europe would be Podemos in Spain. So this left-wing populist party led by Pablo Iglesias. Syriza in Greece, another left-wing populist party, which is, again, essentially anti-neoliberal party. In the US popular discourse, neoliberalism rarely appears because neoliberalism is the American politics, right? If you question neoliberalism, you're often, branded as a radical, and then you're excluded from the system. So Sanders, similar to Iglesias, similar to Alexis Tsipras in Greece, he basically challenged austerity policies. He challenged and questioned, the neoliberal hegemony, if I may call it a hegemony. From a Latin American point of view, because of his, socialist appeal, Sanders did have some similarities with leaders like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and then Evo Morales in Bolivia. But I find it more comparable to the European cases, mainly because Latin American countries are formerly colonized, countries that have their own history with military coups, U.S. imperialism, and and victimization by various sorts of domination. So again, what I just said, Sanders did capitalize on discontent with neoliberalism, especially among young people. So he did, Sanders's base, I would say, is a young, urban, you know, urban, young, educated people who are basically disturbed at the massive income and wealth inequality in the United States, the concentration of wealth in the top 1%. Um, and also, I would say in the rural areas as well, he did have an appeal because of his economic nativism, right? He also opposed, similar to Trump, he also opposes free trade deals. Trump opposed it on basically the cultural means, but he opposed it based on the oppression of the working class by these corporations in the United States and also transnationally. What Sanders did, in my view, successfully, so he is also a successful leader. He managed to mainstream social democratic ideas through his candidacy. I remember in 2016, Sanders was saying healthcare is a human right, and Hillary Clinton didn't agree with that. So, but in the 2020 race, all Democratic candidates agreed that healthcare is a human right, and all the Democratic candidates agreed that you have to, pay attention to the wealth inequality in this country. So I would say even though his candidacy failed, to capture the Democratic Party, he did push the Democratic Party to the left, and that's again because of his populism of he put the American people on the one hand and the 1% on the other. Any Sanders speech you go, any Sanders speech you watch, he will always mention the 1%. So that's his basically enemy. The other thing he did was to inspire a young group of politicians in mainly urban areas. So examples of this include Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, okay? So the members of the squad, right? And some more recent are Jamal Bowman in New York, Cory Bush from St. Louis, Missouri. So even though he is this old Jewish guy, who has been in power in politics for decades, he managed to inspire a Puerto Rican person, bartender from New York. He managed to inspire Ilhan Omar, a Somali refugee who came to the United States. So in that sense, he is also an interesting, I would say, phenomena to understand the populist challenge, but not to the Republican Party, but to the Democratic Party. Okay, so let's talk about the United States' overall performance when it comes to its democracy. So just to give a general picture, according to Freedom House, which is one of the, these institutions out there that evaluates countries' levels of democracy and freedom, the United States has a score of 86 out of 100, okay? Freedom House rates countries as free, partly free, and not free. So the United States is a free country, but if you use a letter grade, the US democracy is a B. Will get a B. He's not going to get a B plus or an A minus or an A. So I think in the US, one of the issues, what I see in the domestic discussions is a lot of people assume that the United States is the best democracy in the world. It's the greatest country in the world. And this is just, we're showing our democracy to other people. But in fact, the United States is not even ranked in the top 50 in the world. So there are at least 50 countries in the world that are more democratic than the United States, based on Freedom House indicators. So I will talk about some of the reasons why the United States is not as democratic as it should be. Okay, one of them is ideological, and the other them is affective polarization. Ideological polarization, and again on the screen, basically tells you that people in the United States over time, 1994, 2004, 2014, ideologically, Democrats and Republicans are being more distant from one another, which means in 1994, there was a lot of ideological overlap between the Democrats and the Republicans, right? In 2004, that divide increased, and in 2014, that divide even further increased. especially among people who are engaged in politics. So if you follow the news, if you follow campaigns, and if you donate to campaigns, if you are active in politics, the chances are high that you're among the most polarized group in the United States. So in that sense, if you just look at the 2014, I would argue that Trump did not cause polarization in the United States, but he in that capitalized on polarization in the United States, right? And given this polarized environment, even though someone like Joe Biden, who positions himself as a centrist, he still gets the 92% of Democrats, and Trump gets 92% of the Republicans. So you don't really have much room to get votes and supports from the other party, because simply ideologically, they're becoming more and more different. The other important thing, which I find it interesting for my research, is it's not just ideology, but it's also feelings. Okay, so the one on the top is in-party feeling, and the one on the bottom is odd-party feeling. So basically asking people their feelings from 0 to 100, asking Democrats how do you feel about Democrats, how warm do you feel, and asking Republicans how warm do you feel about Republicans, and then Democrats. So this is basically the finding. Even though over time people's evaluation of their in-group has remained constant, Republicans more and more, they hate Democrats, and Democrats more and more, they feel negative towards Democrats versus Republicans. So scholars like Iyengar call it affective polarization, right? So it's not necessarily about ideas. So it doesn't matter what you're standing for. Just because you're a Democrat, I have negative feelings towards you, or just because you're a Republican, I have negative feelings about you, which is definitely something that erodes the ability to work across the aisle. But even at the citizen level, one of the measures of this is around half of the Americans wouldn't be happy if their daughters and sons married to someone from the opposite party. This was not a thing in the 1960s and the 1970s. But today, basically, Republicans surround themselves with Republicans, Democrats surround themselves with Democrats, which creates these bubbles and echo chambers that we just reproduce our existing prejudices about the other. The other thing that erodes, I would say, democracy in the United States is what I call, and what also scholars like Steve Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt call, minoritarian institutions. Because democracy is supposed to be majority rule and minority protection, right? Liberal democracy is built on winning majorities, but at the same time not leaving out the minority. But in the United States, the way the system is designed is actually currently helps to sustain white Christian rural minority in power at the expense of more diverse or urban majority in the country. One obvious data point here is the Electoral College, right? So for every one elector in Wyoming, there is 195,000 people, but this is in the case of California, 712,000 people. The other example, obviously, be the Senate, right? In the United States, because of the federal system, Wyoming and California, they each get two senators. So even though the Republicans over and over again, they lose the popular vote in the senatorial elections, they still maintain, the majority control of the Senate. The other issue, since 1992, a Republican president has only won the popular vote once, in 2004. Bill Clinton won it twice. Al Gore won it in 2000. Bush won it in 2004. Obama won it twice. Hillary Clinton won it, and Joe Biden is winning it. So United States is the only country in the world where you can win the popular vote but lose the presidency. So that's one of the reasons why the United States' democracy is not an A+, but a B+. because democracy is supposed to be about majority rule, but the protection of minority. But because of the way system is designed in the United States and the current demographics, basically, if you live in Wyoming and if you live in, Iowa, let's say, your voice is going to be more important compared to someone living in more urban areas. This is again the electoral college is one, Senate is another. In the House of Representatives too, because of the current size of House of Representatives, it also gives overemphasis to smaller states and rural areas. So that's why there is some discussion whether to expand that as well. You might remember the Iowa caucuses, the Democratic Iowa caucuses. So this is not just a Republican issue. The Democrats are also minoritarian because the winner of the Iowa caucus is not determined by the popular vote, but it's determined by how many state delegates someone wins, right? So in that sense, even if you have more votes in the Iowa caucuses, you're not going to be declared as the victor of the Iowa caucuses because you don't have enough state delegates. I checked I compared the Iowa caucus map with the current map in Iowa. There are only 6 counties that voted for Biden in Iowa, and 93 voted for Trump. And out of those 6 countries, the so-called winner of the Iowa caucus didn't carry any. So Pete Buttigieg, all the states Pete Buttigieg won, or all the counties, sorry, they ended up voting for Trump. And out of those 6, 5 of them went to Sanders, and 1 of them went to Warren. So which also shows it's not just about the narrative that Republicans are benefiting, but within the Democratic Party too, in the 2016 primaries, there was a super delegates, right? Even if you win the popular vote, even if you're the most popular, the super delegates could have just picked someone else. So these are, again, some issues that from a comparative standpoint doesn't quite make sense, because there is no country around the world that you can just win an election but lose it because of this archaic electoral system. The other interesting fact to you, Trump actually got more votes from blue states than red states, right, in this election. So actually there are more Trump supporters living in blue states than red states. And I would argue because of the electoral college, their votes are also wasted, right? Basically, if you live in California, if you live in New York, and if you're a huge Trump supporter, your voice is not heard at all because that state is called as soon as the polls close. So this is quite, challenging in the U.S. The other thing is the elections are not very modern in the United States. The way elections are held is very problematical with low electoral integrity. So Pippa Norris from Harvard University, she has this project called Electoral Integrity Project. She asked basically experts to rate the integrity of elections in the United States and in 50 states. So from 0 to 100, 100 meaning your elections are really well done, it's free and fair, the counting process, registration, there's no voting suppression, there's no gerrymandering that benefits a certain political party. And this is the result. So luckily, currently we live in a state that has one of the best electoral, I would say, processes in the United States. So Iowa has a 75 out of 100. But if you look at all these states that were on the news the other day, Arizona has a 62, Georgia has a 48, right? Florida has 55, Pennsylvania has 62. So in other words, given the lack of a national electoral council in the United States, by the way, in all countries around the world, there's a national electoral council, right? There is a national electoral council in Turkey, there is one in Argentina, there is one in Kenya, there is one in Japan. So the state level of administration of the elections is pretty unique to the United States, which not only from a counting perspective, but also I would say from a voter suppression perspective, it discriminates against people of color. It discriminates against people, African Americans living in the South. So one of the reasons why Georgia is today in play is because of, the Democrats in Georgia, their ability to organize people and register them because of what happened in 2018 in the governor race. So I wanted to give you just this picture to show that we're not just talking about US as a democracy, but also at the state level, there are some states that are seen more democratic and that have more or better electoral integrity than others. Obviously, the southern states, if you look at region-wise here, are doing much worse compared to the West or Minnesota, Iowa, or the Northeast. Okay, so the other element that I want to talk about is the erosion of liberal democratic values and practices in the United States. So even though United States is seen as a liberal democracy, if actors stop acting democratic, if they don't respect their opponents and if they see their opponents as enemies, which is the case, I would say, for both Democrats and Republicans, then democratic values and practices start to, erode slowly. But I want to focus on the Republican Party here. This is from the Varieties of Democracy project, and they basically ranked or located different political parties around the world in terms of their illiberalism score. Basically, liberalism in this sense meaning the respect for rule of law, minority rights, okay, separation of powers, constitutionalism, etc. So what you see here, which is again, I think, linked to Trump's capturing of the Republican Party, right? From 2014 to 2016, the Republican Party has become more illiberal, basically moved away from, being a center-right political party, but being a far-right political party. Just to give you an example here, the closest parties to the United States based on this index are AKP from Turkey, BJP from India, and Fidesz from Hungary. So in that sense, originally what I said, even though I think the Democrats and Republicans are both responsible for polarization, they're both responsible for undermining democracy, but I think the main issue that we need to address in the future is how to save the Republican Party so that the Republican Party can become a center-right political party that respects, others. So as you see right now, there are only very few Republican senators that recognize Joe Biden's, president-elect status, which I think also shows that when they win, it's good. When they lose, it's not good, which is a good sign of, pretty reliable sign of illiberalism. Because in Turkey, just to give you an example, in 2019, there was elections in Istanbul, and Erdogan's party lost those elections, but they didn't recognize those elections. They called electoral fraud. They said, there's fraud here, no evidence. And the famous phrase at that time was, even if nothing has happened, something must have happened. And what happened in Turkey was, because of the Electoral Council and authoritarianism, we had to repeat those elections. But interestingly, very similar to the United States, Erdogan claimed that the fraud was only in the mayoral part of the ballot. The other parts of the ballot were fine. There was no fraud in the local assemblies. There was no fraud in any other elected officials, but the mayor, because that's the one he lost, right? I think we see a similar discourse here in the United States, that Republicans are quite happy that they're expanding their seats in the House. They're most likely going to retain the Senate, but for some reason in the presidency there was a big fraud, which I would say is not just something promoted by Trump, but also because of his capture of the political party, I think voiced by other Republicans. The other data point about the Republican Party here, again, this is also, this has basically two dimensions. One is if the party respects or undermines liberal democratic principles, norms, and practices. And the other is party favors or opposes ethnic minority rights. So the Republican Party here with the red dot it is closer, it has a score of 8, which means it does oppress ethnic minority rights, okay, based on this expert survey. Uh, Also, on the scale of 0 to 10, it's also pretty close to, fully undermining liberal democratic principles and norms. Just based on this survey, again, the Republican Party is closest to the Law and Justice Party in Poland, okay? Again, the Justice and Development Party in Turkey, okay? Um, and Vox in Spain, this far-right political party in Spain, okay? Uh, Rather than more center-right political parties. Again, I'm not putting the blame on one political party, but the research, comparative research suggests that in the United States, we have a center-left political party and we have a far-right political party. So because of that, and because of Trump's capture of the Republican Party, um, I don't think those parties are equally responsible for undermining democracy. I don't think those parties are equally responsible for undermining accountability, the rule of law. I think the whole impeachment of Trump and not the fact that he was not removed from office shows the partisan nature of impeachment in the House, that not a single Republican voted for impeachment in the House. And in the Senate, uh, Trump was not removed mainly because of the Republican support. So, before I conclude, my question, so given all these issues, given the lack of respect for liberal democratic values in the United States, given the fact that the Republican Party under Trump has evolved into a far-right political party, can Joe Biden restore the soul of America? I think that's the million-dollar question right now. I would argue that Biden can reverse democratic backsliding. So I think for people who believe in liberal democracy, and to believe in liberal democracy, you don't have to be a Democrat or a Republican. You just need to believe in the basic democratic principles in the Western world. I think just because Trump will be gone from the White House, Biden can reverse some of the, can rebuild trust in the presidency and can basically at least prevent further damage from a 4-year Trump presidency. So that will be my first take. But I don't think Biden can overcome negative partisanship. Negative partisanship is basically a lot of Democrats vote for Democrats not because they love Democrats, it's because they hate Republicans, right? A lot of Republicans voted for Trump not because they love Trump, it's because they hate Nancy Pelosi, they hate AOC, they hate the idea of Democrats coming to power. So in that sense, even though Joe Biden had people like John Kasich or Lincoln Project supporting him, Biden didn't get any extra Republican support in any of the states. So Biden was elected with the Democratic, and Trump got more than 70 million votes because of the Republican votes. Um, and it's also, I think, striking to underline that Trump got more votes than Hillary Clinton, okay, because of the high turnout. So that's why one of the reasons why I don't anticipate Trump going away, because he has solid support within the Republican Party. So I also argue that there is no return to normalcy or decency, because Joe Biden, I think, mistakenly said that the character of this country is on the ballot. Joe Biden won, but more than 70 million people voted for Trump. If you're making a character decency-based argument, are you trying to imply that 70 million Americans lack character, or 70 million Americans lack decency, right? So even though Joe Biden seems to be a non-polarizing candidate, because he presented this as a moral choice between good and the evil, and I think the results are a bit disappointing for Democrats who thought that the Republicans are just going to reject Trump for all these things that happened in the last 4 years. Based on the negative partisanship literature, I would argue that the Republicans who voted for Trump, again, mainly voted because of their partisan identity, because they identify as a Republican, but also because of their anti-democratic anti-democratic party attitudes. And similarly, honestly, a lot of people in this room or people listening to us, a lot of people didn't vote for Biden. They voted against Trump, right? A lot of people are not a big fan of Biden, and I would argue Biden actually doesn't have much of a base, right? Biden is more of a unifier of different factions within the party. So I think that's why there is absolutely no return to normalcy or decency. And I think we can observe this on just recent developments that there's lack of recognition of the results, disputing. I think similar to what happened to Obama with the birtherism movement, a lot of people will not see Biden's presidency as legitimate, right? Even though the Republicans are, going to eventually change their views, I think the damage has already been done to U.S. democracy in the last few days because of this violation of rules. Trump just said, since when the media has been calling the winners? Well, since such a long time. I mean, Trump became the winner in 2016 because the media called it and Hillary Clinton gave him a call. So he is the one, violating the rules, and the Republican politicians are either silent or they're just, supporting people like Lindsey Graham, basically encouraging um, Trump to undermine democracy. So in that sense, from my perspective, people like Mitch McConnell or Lindsey Graham are also undermining American democracy. So it's not just Trump is gone and then there will be decency and normalcy. Um, Again, it's not essentially an anti-Republican argument, but it points out the evolution of the Republican Party that is more in line with far right than center right ideals. So given these, I would argue that it is hard to govern for Biden without Senate Republicans. The whole Supreme Court nomination and confirmation, I think, showed that the Republican Party in the Senate are going to go based on power politics than principles, right? Remember Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland didn't go through because it was the election year. But when RBG passed away, basically the new nominee was rushed um, in uh, in the in the Senate. Going back, if I would say if Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election after Antonin Scalia's death, I don't think the Republicans were going to confirm any justice by Hillary Clinton. So I think there is a chance that if a Supreme Court vacancy arises under Biden presidency, there is a chance that that person might not get confirmed. So I think that's one of the issues that Biden has to work with, even though you might argue he might, come together with some moderate Republicans to pass his agenda, which is, I think, going to be very hard. So the future of populism, and this is the last slide. So based on all these things that I have told you, I don't think populism on the right or the left are going anywhere. So populism on the right, some people call it Trumpism, but I think it's broader than Trump. I don't think it's going anywhere. Within the Republican Party, Trump has more than 90% approval, more than 90% support. He got more votes than Hillary Clinton. He's very popular. Even though he's defeated, his popularity is gonna remain. And the populist left isn't going anywhere either. One thing from the broader populism literature is populist leaders actually never ever retire. They always continue to play the victim card because that victimization gives them the narrative to you know to promote their agenda. I don't know if anybody followed, but the former Bolivian President Evo Morales, he was kicked out of the country, so he had to resign and leave. And then in recent weeks, Bolivia had another election, and his party basically returned. During that whole time, Evo Morales continued to shape Bolivian politics through Twitter, through his followers. And today, he basically physically returned to Bolivia, walking the Bolivian-Argentinian border with the current Argentinian president, Alberto Fernandez. The other example, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, he finished and then he went to Belgium. He is in exile, but he continues to shape Ecuadorian politics, from behind. A more, again, famous example in the Argentinian case is Peron, right? He spent a lot of his years abroad in exile, but Peronismo continued to shape Argentinian politics. So in that sense, I think Trump basically playing the victim card right now, saying that it's a fraud, is basically not about this election itself, but it's about his future messaging of how he appeals and how he brands himself and his movement. So given this, then we can ask the question, then are we going to have Trump 2024, 2028, 2032? I'm not quite sure if Trump will run again, but I wouldn't be surprised if Trump continues to hold rallies. I wouldn't be I wouldn't be surprised if Trump continues to tweet about Biden. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump is always on TV on Fox News, trying to undermine a Biden presidency. Obviously, because of the personalistic aspect of populism, Trump doesn't have to run himself, but Don Jr. or Ivanka might eventually want to just try, or Jared Kushner, to be the nominee. And I think since we're in Iowa caucuses 2024, I think are going to be interesting for that purpose, because the Republican Party basically needs to grapple with this issue, right? How is it going to look like after Trump? And to be honest, because of his popularity, I think even if he is not the candidate, he's going to be the main person to determine. His endorsement, in the worst case, is gonna shape this party. The other from the left, the main question to ask is: can people like Sanders, AOC, and Warren push Biden, Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer to the left, right? So on the right, you have Trump, who is going to be out of power, but is going to continue to shape the Republicans. And on the left, you have actually this year more progressives winning House seats. So someone like Cory Bush or Jamal Bowman in New York, they're elected as a progressive to the House, while people like Abby Finkenauer in Iowa, she lost her seat as a more center-left Pelosi Biden candidate. So this is, I would say, the other dynamic which will make it hard for Biden to govern, because Biden is not only going to be challenged by the Republicans, right, but also is going to be challenged by inside his political party. So last point, then based on all these and given Biden's age, will Biden be a one-term president? I remember during the primaries, that was an idea that was circulating, that Biden is just going to restore the soul of America, is going to restore democratic institutions, and then after, someone will take over. I would say the natural candidate to this was obviously Kamala Harris, right? Who, if she is the nominee, will become the first, woman of color, first Black woman, first Indian woman on the ballot. But I also want to assume that Kamala Harris will have an easy path, to the 2024 election. Because if Kamala Harris is perceived as a centrist, which I think she has been more centrist in the last couple of months after her vice presidential candidate, I think she can also be challenged by the left faction of the Democratic Party. So the major takeaway, and I want to come to your questions after, populism in the US did not occur because just of an accident in 2016. It's not just because Trump won Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin with small margins. It does have structural reasons, on the right and on the left. Trump managed to transform the Republican Party from a more center-right to a far-right political party. So that's, I think, one question for American politics. And then the second question, Biden was essentially the anti-Trump candidate, right? He managed to bring moderate Republicans, radical left, more establishment Democrats. Can Biden really hold these people, these groups together in his presidency? Because to me, the more unified part today looks like the Republicans. The Republicans are actually more homogenous and more unified around Trump and far-right illiberal ideas than the Democrats or the so-called Biden coalition that looks more fragmented, more, more fragmented also, ideologically, but also generationally, And again, between the establishment Democrats versus the populist left. So I'm gonna end it here. Hopefully, I could keep your attention during this 55-minute talk, but I want to open it up to questions in person, and if there's questions through the chat, you can use the chat, and then Salome will tell me those questions. Thank you. Okay. Any questions? John?
I need to leave in just a minute, so I want to ask a question and then I have to take off. But you said that one of the main divisions in the U.S., and this is not unique to you, is the urban-rural.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm wondering whether you see a similar urban-rural divide in other places, if we take that comparative.
Yeah.
Turkey, for example,
Yeah.
also has big cities and has vast
Correct.
Rural areas. Is there something
It is.
similar? Is there a similar dynamic at play there? And does that give us any sense of where that might head for the U.S.?
It is. The whole Brexit happened because of rural Brits, wanted to leave the EU. If you look at results in more metropolitan and cosmopolitan areas like London, they overwhelmingly voted to stay in the EU, right? So Brexit is, I would say, one example. Hungary is also another example. Viktor Orban, the biggest opposition to Orban is in Budapest, right? So which I think, again, shows these global trends, that the resistance to these leaders, they tend to not occur or arise in rural areas, but they tend to arise in the cosmopolitan and the most globalized parts of the country, right? The Black Lives Matter protests, I think, in the United States, right, it was more in much of an urban phenomenon. In the Turkish case, Erdogan, in the last elections, he lost all three major cities, right? He is more of a rural religious, rural religious base. In Latin America, leaders like Chavez, Correa, they also have a strong rural component. And obviously here, for right-wing populism, I think there is also an ethnic racial dimension, right? People in rural areas are more homogenous racially and ethnically. So right-wing populists, their ideal citizen does not live in Manhattan, does not live in Budapest, does not live in London, but lives in the middle country. In the populism literature, the term for that is heartland, right? If you live in the heartland, you're basically conceived as this ideal citizen, right, from a more nativist point of view. And then that basically becomes your core constituency. The main issue in the US is the Electoral College, the Senate, and many other institutions actually overrepresent people living in the rural areas. While that's not the case in Hungary, that's not the case in Turkey, that's not the case in the United Kingdom. So the rural-urban division exists around the world, and I think that's mainly because of cultural globalization, economic globalization. But what makes U.S. anti-democratic in this sense is basically the urban majority does have a much of a lesser voice in the political system. Yeah, thank you. Mike?
Yeah. In other countries, who controls the National Electoral Council?
Well, it's usually impartial, justices. So basically, people who are either appointed by the parliament, or people that are just coming from the judicial tradition. In authoritarian countries like Venezuela, it's basically all Chavistas, controlling. Yeah, yeah.
National Electoral Council this year, and it was controlled by,
exactly.
They were appointed by the president, and Trump would control the.
Correct.
Trump would have controlled the election.
So in that sense, the U.S. the lack of a national electoral council makes it hard in the US to steal an election, because you have to steal it's in so many counties and so many states. You can't do it, but it also makes it inefficient, and it makes it hard to vote. So my famous phrase is, if the United States had a US embassy in it, the US embassy would be releasing statements every day about the violations of democratic principles. So the biggest advantage of US is that it lacks a US embassy, because the US, all these things that are happening in the US are happening in other parts of the world. And whenever those things happen, the State Department or the ambassador, condemns. In what happened in Bolivia is they stopped the count, and then Evo Morales declared he's the victor. And then the US was like, how can you stop the count? And how can you declare victory? And then this whole election, the biggest slogan is stop the count. So I think they can't do it. They can't do it. But it is undermined by the incumbent leader and the supporters. So that's why I think the electoral council is important. In the US, it is, I think, almost impossible to do that, right? Um, but that's one of the reasons why the elections are not high quality in the US, and it varies state by state. Soren?
Why do you think that the right-wing populism has become so much more virile and potent than the left-wing populism?
Right wing, say it again.
I'm sorry. I mean, I would say that the right-wing populism is much more potent in American politics currently than anything seen on the left. If you agree with that, why do you think that is?
I think it's also, I mean, the reason why Trump got the nomination, right, is I think because of, again, the institutions. In the Democratic Party, even if you win a state, you win a proportion of delegates. When Trump was initially rising in the Republican Party, he didn't have 50%, right? He had, I think, 30% something. But because of the winner-take-all system, Trump, even though he got lower, again, minoritarianism, right? Even though he got 30, he got the entire delegates and he ran the board. So I think Florida was one of those states, right? Early states that Trump won. And then he basically got the entire delegates from Florida. Whereas in Democrats, the reason why left-wing populism in 2016 was, limited is in Iowa caucuses in 2016, it was very close, but the CNN was not only reporting the Iowa caucus delegates, but also reporting hundreds of super delegates that are going to support Clinton. So I think that also set the narrative right from day one, that even if you win the proportional vote, at the end of the day, the super delegates are going to decide. I think for the Republican Party, if they want to prevent another Trump, they probably need to adjust their rules. Because I think because Trumpism is the biggest faction in the Republican Party, in 2024, Trump or Tucker Carlson or Ivanka or Don Jr., they can just get like 40% in each state, and then they can become the nominee. So I think the institutions in that sense are important. Yeah.
Not all states are winner-take-all.
Not all, not all.
But some of them are.
Yeah, some of them are. So it's not all states, but in the Democrats, there is no state that is winner take all. Right? It's more proportional, which makes the process longer, right? But I think that's one of the reasons. In the 2020, I think the main reason why the populist left didn't come to power, is because it was divided between Sanders and Warren, right? If Sanders and Warren, if let's say Sanders didn't run and Warren ran, I think they could have a better chance, or vice versa. While the establishment Democrats, they united around Joe Biden in Super Tuesday, right? So I think the Democratic establishment was smarter to contain left-wing populism, whereas the Republican establishment basically had a meltdown against Trump. Because, remember, Trump was calling names, and I showed that in class, that Jeb Bush told Trump that you cannot, win presidency by just insulting everyone and calling names, but that's what exactly happened. So the Republican Party didn't really foresee that, whereas the Democrats managed to, contain, in my view. Okay. Any questions over there? Yeah, so again, that would be my overall take. Again, I'm not a U.S. politics expert, so I don't want to be, I don't want to overstate these. But if you're going to leave this room with one, takeaway, that should be the U.S. is part of the world. It's not, this exceptional country that is so isolated from other places. So whatever is going on in Europe, whatever is going on in Latin America, will have implications to the United States. And given these minoritarian institutions that come with federalism in the US, it is still possible, I would say, for someone in 2024 to run as a far right candidate and then lose the popular vote, but win the Electoral College. But I think from a democratic perspective, that's not the best image for a country to have have the losers of the popular vote winning, back to back. I think the Senate itself, because of the federalism, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? But the Democrats are also being smart about it, that they're trying to push DC statehood and Puerto Rico, right? Which I think also would further undermine democracy. Or there was some talk about expanding the court, right, the Supreme Court, because on the US Constitution, it doesn't talk about the size of the Supreme Court, right? So if the Democrats had the Senate and then they expanded the Supreme Court, I think that would also further undermine democracy. So even though in my presentation, I put more emphasis on the Republican Party, I also think that the Democrats are also responsible for polarization. They're also responsible um, for this negative partisanship and just benefiting from not being Trump, rather than putting forward a clear agenda. To me, Joe Biden's, again, I can't tell you a single policy that Joe Biden is going to implement for sure, because his entire campaign was about moral values, decency, um, and restoring the soul. And I think he basically won because he managed to bring together a coalition of anti-Trump supporters and elites, whereas the opposite camp, more than 70 million votes, to me looks more united, more homogenous, and even if they they seem to lose the election, they're now willing to concede because it benefits their agenda, and it's because their base basically demands that from them. I think the interesting thing, and let me end with a positive note about the US, if the US was a really authoritarian country, Fox News would not call the election for Biden. Okay, so I think the fact that Fox News called Arizona on the election night, the fact that Fox News called Joe Biden president-elect, I think shows that despite all these attacks, despite being a partisan news network, it still has some commitment, to liberal democratic values. In Turkey, yesterday, Erdogan's son-in-law resigned from his post. He was the Minister of Economics. He resigned on Instagram. The Turkish CNN could not broadcast it for hours because they didn't know what to say. So in an actual authoritarian place, the media cannot do anything independent of the incumbent. So in the US, despite all these attacks, Fox News and CNN, they still have some, autonomy. Fox News is being as a Republican, pro-Republican news network, calling Arizona and the president-elect, and CNN, despite being called as fake news and all these attacks, it did, I think, still retain some commitment to democracy, independent of just being anti-Trump. So thank you for coming. And again, if you have any other questions, we can continue this conversation down the road.